In this video, I want to talk about 5 surprising sensory habits late diagnosed spouses mistakenly assume are perfectly normal. If you were diagnosed with autism later in life, there's a good chance you spent decades assuming that some of your sensory habits were completely normal. You may have thought everybody hated fluorescent lights that much. Everybody had a favorite shirt they wanted to wear constantly. Everybody hummed, tapped, or rocked, or rubbed their fingers together, or needed the television volume set at exactly the right number. And then you got married. Suddenly, another person was living close enough to notice all the little things you'd been doing automatically for years. Marriage has a remarkable way of revealing things about yourself that apparently escaped the attention of everyone else from the previous 40 years. Your spouse might say, "Why do you always cut the tags out of your shirts?" But you, as the ASD spouse, may be thinking, "The real question is why clothing manufacturers are sewing tiny pieces of sandpaper onto the backs of our necks." Your NT spouse may have called your habits quirks. They may have thought you were being rigid, picky, controlling, antisocial, or difficult, and you may not have had an explanation because, from your perspective, you weren't doing anything unusual. You were simply trying to feel okay. So, for most autistic adults who are diagnosed later in life, one of the biggest revelations is discovering that behaviors they considered personality traits may actually have been ways of regulating their nervous system. Suddenly, 50 years of mysterious personal habits start making considerably more sense. So today, let's look at 5 surprising common sensory habits that late diagnosed autistic spouses may have assumed were perfectly normal. And if you're married to someone who does these things, this conversation may completely change the way you interpret their behavior. Or at a minimum, you might finally understand why there are 14 identical shirts hanging in your closet. The first surprising habit is persistent humming, tapping, clicking, or making repetitive sounds. Maybe your spouse hums while doing dishes. Maybe they tap their fingers against the steering wheel. Maybe they quietly repeat a phrase from a movie. Maybe they make little sounds while concentrating and don't even realize they're doing it. And then you, as the NT partner, may eventually say, "Would you please stop doing that?" And your autistic spouse may genuinely respond with, "Stop doing what?" Which is rarely the answer the neurotypical spouse was wanting to hear. The NT spouse might say, "That noise that you were just doing." ASD spouse says, "What noise?" "The thing you're doing right now." "I'm not doing anything right now." And then somebody thinks they're crazy. And this begins another episode of Marriage, the mystery nobody asked to solve. That's because repetitive sounds and movements can function as self-regulation. They provide predictable sensory input in an environment that feels unpredictable. In other words, the humming may not be pointless noise. No, it's neurological organization. This is sometimes described as stimming, but many late diagnosed adults never recognized their behavior as stimming because it didn't look like these stereotypical examples they'd seen associated with autism. They simply knew that concentrating felt easier when they tapped their fingers. Thinking felt easier when they paced. Driving felt easier when they hummed. And apparently folding laundry requires performing the entire soundtrack from a movie released in 1987. The behavior may have been helping their nervous system regulate itself for decades. Now, the second surprising habit is wearing the same clothes over and over again. Now, this creates some fascinating marital conversations. Your NT spouse says, "You have 12 shirts. Why do you keep wearing the same one?" "Because that shirt passed the sensory inspection. That tag didn't scratch. That collar didn't touch the neck incorrectly. The fabric didn't cling. The sleeves didn't commit unexpected crimes. And the waistband doesn't suddenly declare war on the nervous system halfway through dinner." And once you find a shirt that satisfies all these requirements, you don't simply have a shirt. No, you've discovered a resource. And you may want to find another one of those exact shirts and buy 12 more of them. Add different colors if you're feeling adventurous. Or maybe you want to buy the exact same color because we're not here to make reckless decisions. Now, to someone without significant clothing sensitivities, this looks like stubbornness or an unwillingness to try something new. But for an autistic adult, clothing can be experienced much more intensely. And once they find something that works, predictability becomes very valuable. That favorite sweatshirt isn't necessarily a fashion statement. It is a sensory safe zone. And at some point, that sweatshirt may technically qualify as a historical artifact, but that's a separate discussion. And this is where couples can get into unnecessary power struggles. The NT spouse thinks, "Why are you being so rigid?" The autistic spouse thinks, "Why are you trying to make me wear something that feels like a burlap sack filled with angry insects?" Both people are talking about clothing, but only one of them is experiencing the clothing as a nervous system event. Now, the third surprising habit is controlling light. Some autistic adults have spent their entire lives turning off overhead lights, closing curtains, wearing sunglasses when other people think it isn't particularly bright, or choosing lamps instead of ceiling lights. And once again, they may assume everyone experiences light the same way. Imagine spending 40 years believing that fluorescent lights are objectively awful, only to discover that half the people around you barely notice it. That can be a revelation. You mean people have been sitting underneath these lights voluntarily? Yeah. In marriage, however, these sensory differences can easily become personalized. One spouse walks into the kitchen and turns on every light. The other walks behind them and turns half of them off. 5 minutes later, the first spouse turns them back on again. Congratulations, you've accidentally invented sensory ping pong, and neither person knows they're playing. There are no official rules, and somehow both people are losing. But underneath that tiny domestic conflict may be two completely different neurological experiences. For one person, the room feels dark. For the other, it feels like they're being interrogated by the FBI. Once couples understand that distinction, the argument can change from, why do you always have to control the lights? To, how can we make this room comfortable for the both of us? Now, that's a much more useful conversation. It's also significantly cheaper than installing separate electrical systems for each spouse. Now, the fourth surprising habit is needing very specific sensory conditions for sleep. The fan has to be running, the room has to be cold, the blanket has to be the right weight, the television can't be on, or perhaps the television absolutely must be on. For the autistic spouse, there may need to be white noise, blackout curtains, a certain pillow, a particular side of the bed, or complete silence. And heaven help the person who replaces the pillow. Oh boy, what happened to my pillow? Oh, I bought you a new one. You what? Because that pillow wasn't simply a pillow. That pillow had been carefully broken in through 9 years of negotiations between the human head, neck, mattress, gravitational forces, and possibly the United Nations. To the other spouse, all of this can sometimes look very excessive and a little bit psychotic. But sleep requires the nervous system to surrender vigilance. And if someone is unusually sensitive to sound, temperature, texture, movement, light, small sensory disruptions, those can become enormous barriers to settling down. The ticking clock that one spouse barely hears may sound like a tiny construction crew working beside the other spouse's head. That dog scratching 3 rooms away sounds like thunder. The refrigerator cycling on, whew, that sounds like a Boeing 747 preparing for takeoff. The spouse next to you turns over in bed, feels like an earthquake measuring approximately 6.2. This is why sensory combinations shouldn't automatically be interpreted as being high maintenance. Sometimes it's simply good nervous system management. Now, the fifth habit may be the most misunderstood of all. Disappearing after sensory overload. Your ASD spouse comes home from work and goes directly into another room. They don't want to talk. They don't want to be touched. They don't want to answer any damn questions. And they may sit in darkness, put on headphones, play a familiar game, watch the same program they've watched 20 times, or simply stare at their phone. Now, the NT spouse may experience this as rejection. I've been waiting all day to see you and you just disappeared. That hurt is real. But the withdrawal may not mean I don't want you. It may mean my nervous system has nothing left. Think of it like a smartphone battery sitting at 2%. Technically, the phone is still functioning, but this is probably not the ideal moment to download a major software update. This is often exactly what the neurotypical spouse says. Can we talk about something before you go to bed? And the autistic spouse's nervous system quietly whispers, oh, shit. That distinction is enormously important in neurodiverse relationships. Because when sensory recovery gets interpreted as emotional rejection, both spouses can become defensive. One person pursues connection precisely when the other person desperately needs decompression. The overwhelmed spouse retreats further. The other spouse feels increasingly abandoned. And suddenly, a sensory problem has become a relationship problem. The original issue was basically, my nervous system needs about 30 minutes to decompress. 45 minutes later, you're discussing something that happened on vacation in 2013. Nobody knows how you got there. This is why late diagnosis can sometimes bring unexpected relief to the marriage. It gives couples a new language. Instead of saying, you're ridiculously picky, you can ask, is something here overwhelming your senses? Instead of saying, why are you shutting me out? You can ask, do you need 20 minutes or so to decompress before we try to talk? Instead of saying, why do you always have to have everything your way? You can become curious about what the nervous system underneath the behavior is trying to accomplish. Now, there's an important balance here. Understanding sensory needs does not mean every behavior automatically becomes acceptable or that one spouse's needs should dominate the household. No, marriage still requires negotiation. If one spouse needs silence and the other needs music, you need a solution. Headphones have probably saved more marriages than they receive credit for. If one spouse needs dim lighting and the other needs bright lighting to function comfortably, you need a solution. If one spouse needs decompression after work and the other needs connection, you need a plan that respects both needs. The goal isn't to determine whose nervous system is correct, because nervous systems don't hold committee meetings. They don't sit down at the kitchen table and say, okay, well, after reviewing all the available evidence, we have determined that Linda's preferred lighting level is objectively reasonable. Two people can experience exactly the same environment very differently. The goal is to stop assigning negative motives to neurological differences, because sometimes the behavior that looks like stubbornness and rigidity is actually regulation. Sometimes the habit that looks strange and weird is actually soothing. Sometimes the ritual that looks unnecessary and psychotic is providing predictability. And sometimes the spouse who has been told for 40 or 50 years, "Why are you so picky?" is discovering for the first time that there was actually a reason. The discovery can bring grief, and it can also bring relief. And occasionally it brings the deeply satisfying realization, I knew those fluorescent lights were evil. But more importantly, it can bring enormous self-understanding. So if you've received an autism diagnosis later in life, take another look at the little routines you've developed over the years. Ask yourself a surprisingly powerful question. What sensory problems might I be solving without realizing I was solving it? Maybe the fan wasn't just a fan. Maybe the hoodie wasn't just a hoodie. Maybe the pacing wasn't pointless. Maybe sitting in your car for 10 minutes before walking into the front door wasn't weird. Maybe your nervous system figured out some remarkably clever survival strategies long before you understood why you needed them. And if you're married to a late diagnosed autistic spouse, try asking a different question the next time one of these behaviors appears. What might their nervous system be trying to accomplish right now? That one shift from judgment to curiosity can prevent an incredible amount of unnecessary conflict. Because once couples understand the invisible sensory baseline underneath everyday behavior, they stop fighting the coping mechanism and start addressing the actual need. And that's when weird starts looking a whole lot more like wisdom the nervous system developed years before either spouse had a name for it. Although, for the record, if your spouse owns 17 identical gray t-shirts, you're still allowed to find that a little funny. Okay. Would you like to schedule a paid private coaching session? This will be in the form of a face-to-face Zoom call. Underneath any of my videos, you'll see this Calendly link. If you click on that link, it'll open up my calendar. You can pick the available days and times that works for your schedule, and I will be available on that exact day and time, and we will talk.